It was 1974. The aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis was plaguing every news station in America. You had Richard Nixon had officially resigned following the Watergate scandal, and a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was imposed to preserve gas usage across the country. The world was changing, and as it changed, the desire to escape into a movie, a song, or even a game continued to grow.
Scoot over! What do you want to watch? Bomb!
You know, they say Grand Track 10, released and distributed by Atari, was one of the first ever racing video games that was successful. It was a top-down style racing game that came with pedals, a gear shift, and just enough realism that it was an absolute hit in the arcades everywhere. This game would lay the framework for more successful hits that would come down the way, like Pole Position, the one that most people probably remember. So much so that it became the highest grossing arcade hit of 1983. That game would go on to get its own weekly cartoon and went by the same name. Enduro, Pit Stop, Buggy Boy, Great American Cross-Country Road Race, and more laid the framework of what would inevitably be known as the racing game genre.
It's a genre.
And had every AAA gaming company, which wasn't really a thing back then, dedicating resources to this growing space. And while it seemed like the growth of racing arcade games would never teeter out like its adjacent game types that were happening all across the world, it started to when no one expected it, and then changed for some reasons that made sense. Kinda, maybe, a little bit. Speaking of video game titles, I'm excited to officially announce that I'm partnered, officially, with TorqueMotorsport.io. Okay, Torque Motorsport is the motorsport brand behind the Torque video game franchise by Grease Monkey Games. I can't even believe that I get to talk about this. I'm so excited. Their goal is to bring car and motorsport fans together through games and interactive experiences. They'll be getting me behind the scenes at Formula Drift, automotive events, and even the international car culture in places like Europe and Japan. So I'm freaking stoked, all right? I'm super excited. And this topic definitely has me wondering what your first racing video game memory was. So what game or arcade was it? Maybe what was the story? Let me know below because I'd love to hear it, and I'm still responding to every single comment. And thank you, Torque Motorsport, for being a part of this incredible journey that I'm really excited to be a part of. And I am smiling on the inside, all right? And if you're looking to support Pass the Sub, you can check out alexmartini.net. I have some new teas and stuff that are coming out, which I'm really, really excited for. Now, we could spend time talking about Road and Track, The Need for Speed in 1994, or Gran Turismo 2 in 1999, or my favorite boat racing game, Hydro Thunder, 1999. But with over 800 racing video games ever made that we probably care about, we'd probably run out of time. But thinking about that for a second, 800 published games over the course of 40 or so years is pretty impressive. Nobody probably remembers Grand Track. And to be fair, I don't even remember Grand Track. But what I do remember is Burnout 2, Midnight Club 2, and Need for Speed Underground. Those were the games that paved the way for new generation enthusiasts that were starting to look past just video games as an arcade escape, but as a real hobby when we got old enough. A real thing that we could grip our dirty little hands onto and be like, this is what I want to waste money on for the rest of my life. Burnout 2 was a game that blended the concept of arcade gaming with crash physics that were unheard of at the time. You could find a way to spend hours trying to maximize the damage costs and the crash mode that came with the game. I remember so much Mountain Dew those nights. Our memory may only remember the good moments of those video games because they were not perfect, but they still stuck with us over time. The game itself was raw and it was genuine fun. Need for Speed Underground, though, was probably the one that most of us remember. EA Games, and one of my fondest memories I have of that company was the release of this game, solely this game. The music, the mood, the blend of taking what worked so well for Hot Pursuit 2 and the pop culture that was coming out of the Fast and the Furious just locked this game in for what felt like guaranteed success. And the game itself had more than that for successfulness, obviously, but that doesn't really matter, okay? What matters is to the windows, to the walls. The game was massively successful, and you'd see more games spin off like this nighttime street style game that most of us remember. It was awesome. Okay, Most Wanted was another evolution of that nighttime, daytime modification racing game genre that seemed to genuinely speak to the automotive enthusiast. I mean, it was awesome. It had over 16 million copies sold of just this game, okay? With the iconic M3, you remember that livery, becoming a flagship of favorites for teens practically everywhere in the United States. And I would argue a lot of people ended up picking up those M3s when even I turned like 16, 18 years old because of that game. The ability to be chased around by cops, milestone progressions, a wickedly cringe campaign by today's standards, but one that felt righteously difficult in its first playthrough, and again, a super strong soundtrack. Like, to be honest, I still listen to that soundtrack to this day. And when you played the game, the speed felt visceral, the car modifications were sure they're a little bit light than its predecessors, but it was still enough to enjoy, and you could spend hours post-campaign driving around in the free roam world just trying to get caught by cops and then rushing over to your original Xbox to turn it off before anything's saved. Again, a game that just felt right for people who love the car industry and its pop culture. I am rock, I am rock, I'm sorry. But then Carbon came. And I'm not sure what Carbon was or why it didn't quench my thirst of socially current pop songs, but it just wasn't it. Between Most Wanted and Carbon, something changed. Something that I would argue started to split the racing video game genre. You see, around this time, you had a few different types of racing games. You had fully arcade, games that were more eccentric than they were meant to be realistic, games that kind of captured everyday video game players and not just people that liked cars. You had games that were mixed, blending the ideologies of successful arcade games of the past and introducing more elements, physics, and lighting that made it feel a little bit more real. And then you had a small yet growing niche of games. Simulation racing. Gran Turismo 4 was probably one such game and one of the first that I would argue really paved the way for what this whole space would become. With over 11.7 million sales and an HD concept introduced 2 years later, the automotive enthusiasts of the world began to dabble with what felt like real racing. Sure, it wasn't the first simulation racing game. I'm not blind to the 80s, and there's stuff that made you change your tires and gas. But in our generation, this is where there was some major pivotal change. There's over 721 cars, 51 tracks, a B-spec mode, driving missions, photo mode. Jeremy Clarkson even reviewed it. And while the criticism didn't wane from this game, the criticism was different. It wasn't angry about Lil Jon missing from the introduction screen. It was the fact that you could clip on Fuji Speedway and cheat grip for your tires to win races. The people, the drivers, and the group around this game were real semi-pro drivers or ones that wanted to be. This space slowly began to dominate the video game genre of racing. iRacing, being introduced in 2008, along with Euro Truck Simulator and Jeep Thrills, aimed at another subculture within racing games. Simulation at a ground level. A smaller game company that upon initial release did well, it didn't really make a lot of headway until a few years later with Get Community. But while that was happening, Rockstar wasn't really developing a competitor to that. They were busy making Midnight Club Los Angeles. EA Black Box was over focusing on Need for Speed Undercover for all 7 people that cared. And everyone outside of a core few seemed to start chasing what everyone else was doing from a publishing perspective. This started to really play with the industry a bit. Car enthusiasts were getting maybe 1 or 2 games that was worth biting their teeth into each year. But because everyone was trying to be an arcade game, a hybrid game, or some sort of sim racing game, no one really stood out outside of like the steadfast few. We wanted another Most Wanted or even an Underground 2, and people pretty much got anything but. Video games are meant to relate to a feeling, an escape, an emotion, a community, literally anything that makes you feel a little bit disconnected from the world for just like a second. And sure, the games can be pretty and have massive marketing dollars behind them, but that doesn't just make it a good game. Forget about your audience and you start making games like Most Wanted in 2015 that only had its name going for it to be potentially successful. I only bought it because the name was the other name and I thought it would be good. I tried to return it. It can go without saying that there are good games everywhere, ones that support the community that they sell to, like drifting or things like that. But it probably wouldn't be that way if it wasn't actually for the community supporting the game. Forums, mods, and groups are one of the primary reasons the older simulation games are still bought to date. A lot of these games are old as hell. Sure, we may love Assetto, but out of the box, the game's a bit of a mess, and every single time I talk to Eric about figuring it out on my sim rig, it requires my reading glasses and 45 minutes. Video games nowadays are great because the community makes them so. A lot of AAA companies are really messing up the genre outside of Gran Turismo and WRC series, with smaller companies trying to get you to even hear them, like Torque Motorsport. And I don't really feel weird saying that, even though I just told you I partnered with them. Companies like Torque that are making games to appeal to a true, fun audience that enjoys drifting, modification, and the future of the web makes the game and what's behind it feel genuine. And that genuineness isn't there a lot. In comparison to quite the opposite, in which I feel like EA is just trying to steal my kidneys for a $70 Game Pass. They're not built the same, and I think those large companies almost killed the racing genre. If it wasn't for communities maintaining the old games, mid-sized gaming companies testing new formats and genres that have social followings and mods, and that small batch of other gaming companies that are really trying to make something different, I'm pretty sure we'd be unfortunately stuck with another passable Forza Motorsport or another Need for Speed where you probably play John Cena running from a fat bad guy Russell Crowe. Companies that have gotten too big for some reason don't know how to hear what real car enthusiasts want, or what sim racers want, or even what video game people want, which is sometimes just a passable game that you can put into the doohickey and play without 160 gigs of updates. Money grabs and DLC bolt-ons are things that people just shouldn't be okay with, because if you are, the odds of these smaller companies that support these massive communities being able to survive is limited. So go out there, stop buying beta releases that take years to fix, and have some fun with games that might seem a little bit different. But what do you think? Did racing games ever decrease in popularity, or is that just a me thing and I just need to let go of 2005 because 2005 was peak, it had RuneScape, it had Most Wanted, everything I needed? Let me know below, and of course, thank you so much for watching. We will see you later. Goodbye.
Hey!